Karen fined my wife for hanging a flag. Then found out my wife was a federal judge. You know how sometimes life has this peculiar way of serving up justice with a side of irony, so thick you could cut it with a knife? Well, let me tell you about the day my wife Margaret hung an American flag outside our modest suburban home, and how that simple act of patriotism turned into a comedy of errors that would make even the most seasoned scriptwriter weep with laughter. It was a Tuesday morning in late September, the kind where autumn whispers its first promises through golden leaves that dance lazily to the ground. Margaret had just returned from her morning jog, her cheeks flushed with the crisp air and that particular glow that comes from being genuinely content with life. She was still in her running clothes when she decided, quite spontaneously, to hang the flag we'd been meaning to display for months. "Tom," she called out to me as I nursed my second cup of coffee and pretended to read the morning paper while actually scrolling through my phone. "Help me with this flag, would you?" I looked up to see her standing in our front yard, holding the red, white, and blue fabric with the kind of reverence you'd expect from someone who'd spent the better part of her adult life upholding the Constitution. You see, what our neighbors didn't know, what nobody in our quiet little neighborhood of Maple Grove knew, was that my wife Margaret wasn't just any ordinary suburban mom. She was the Honorable Margaret Elizabeth Hartwell, a federal judge with over 15 years on the bench, a woman who'd presided over cases that had shaped legal precedent and whose opinions were quoted in law schools across the country. But to our neighbors, she was simply Maggie from down the street, the woman who brought homemade cookies to block parties and never missed a chance to ask about your kids or your garden. She'd made a conscious decision early in our marriage to keep her professional life separate from our home life, believing that being just another neighbor was more important than being the intimidating federal judge who could send people to prison with the bang of a gavel. As I helped her secure the flag to our modest white colonial's front porch, neither of us could have predicted that this simple act would set in motion a chain of events that would test not only our patience, but also the very fabric of what it means to live in a free society. The flag hung beautifully, catching the morning breeze with a gentle flutter that seemed to say, "Welcome home, America." Margaret stood back, brushing her hands on her running shorts, and smiled with the satisfaction of a job well done. It was a moment of pure, uncomplicated happiness, the kind that makes you remember why you fell in love with someone in the first place. "Perfect," she said, and I had to agree. The flag looked wonderful against the white shutters, a splash of color and meaning that somehow made our house feel more like home. That's when we first noticed her. Karen Pemberton from 3 houses down, standing on her perfectly manicured lawn with her arms crossed and an expression that could sour milk. Even from a distance, you could feel the disapproval radiating from her like heat from asphalt in July. Now, I should probably tell you about Karen. Every neighborhood has one. That person who seems to believe they were personally appointed by some higher authority to police everyone else's business. Karen was our neighborhood's self-appointed guardian of property values and social order, a woman who'd turned complaining into an art form, and whose presence at homeowners association meetings could clear a room faster than a fire alarm. She was the type of person who measured her neighbor's grass with a ruler, who kept detailed notes about garbage placement, and who had somehow convinced herself that her opinion about everything from fence height to flower choice was not only valid, but urgently needed. In the 3 years we'd lived on Elm Street, Karen had filed complaints about everything from our mailbox being 2 inches too far to the left to the color of our garden gnome being too whimsical for the neighborhood's aesthetic. But this morning, as she stood there glaring at our flag, something felt different. There was a particular intensity to her disapproval that suggested she wasn't just annoyed, she was personally offended. Margaret, bless her heart, waved cheerfully in Karen's direction. "Good morning, Karen. Beautiful day, isn't it?" Karen's response was to turn on her heel and march back into her house with the kind of purposeful stride that usually meant trouble was brewing. Margaret and I exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that comes from 22 years of marriage. "Think she's upset about the flag?" I asked, though we both knew the answer. "Probably," Margaret replied with a sigh. "But it's our property, and we have every right to display it." How right she was, though she had no idea just how right she was about to become. The rest of that Tuesday passed peacefully. I went to work at the accounting firm where I'd been a partner for the past decade, dealing with the usual parade of tax problems and financial puzzles that somehow never got old. Margaret spent her day at the federal courthouse downtown, presiding over a complex civil rights case that had been making headlines for weeks, though she never brought work stress home with her. We had dinner together that evening, Margaret's famous lasagna, and a bottle of wine we'd been saving for no particular reason, and talked about ordinary things. My day at the office, her plans for the weekend, whether we should finally replace the kitchen faucet that had been dripping for months. Normal married couple stuff, the kind of comfortable conversation that forms the backbone of a life built together. As we cleaned up the dishes, Margaret glanced out the kitchen window toward our front yard. "The flag looks nice in the evening light," she said, and I followed her gaze to see the red, white, and blue fabric catching the last rays of sunset. "It does," I agreed. "I'm glad we finally put it up." Neither of us noticed the figure watching from the house 3 doors down, or the way Karen Pemberton's silhouette in her window seemed to vibrate with barely contained rage. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that makes you grateful to be alive. Margaret was already up and dressed for work. A sharp navy suit that somehow managed to look both authoritative and approachable, the kind of outfit that commanded respect without demanding it. She was in the kitchen making coffee when the doorbell rang. "I'll get it," I called out, padding to the front door in my robe and slippers, coffee mug in hand. Through the peephole, I could see a man in a uniform holding a clipboard, and my first thought was that we were getting a package delivered early. But when I opened the door, the man's serious expression quickly corrected that assumption. "Thomas Hartwell?" he asked, consulting his clipboard. "That's me," I replied, suddenly aware that I was meeting an official-looking person while wearing a robe covered in dancing penguins. A Christmas gift from my sister that Margaret found inexplicably charming. "I'm Officer Martinez with the Code Enforcement Division," he said, showing me his badge. "I'm here about a violation notice regarding an improperly displayed flag at this residence." I blinked, certain I'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "A complaint was filed yesterday afternoon regarding the American flag displayed on your property. According to the complainant, it violates several municipal codes regarding flag display and homeowner association regulations." I stared at him, coffee mug halfway to my lips. "Are you serious?" Officer Martinez, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world, nodded grimly. "I'm afraid so, sir. I need to issue you a citation for improper flag display, violation of HOA covenant restrictions, and failure to obtain proper permits for exterior decorations." "Permits?" I sputtered. "For an American flag?" According to the complaint, any exterior decoration over a certain size requires prior approval from the Homeowners Association and a city permit for display. That's when Margaret appeared at my shoulder, and I felt the subtle shift in the air that always happened when she went from wife mode to judge mode. It was like watching a gentle breeze transform into a hurricane, gradual but unmistakable. "What seems to be the problem, Officer Martinez?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular tone that made lawyers straighten their ties and witnesses choose their words more carefully. Officer Martinez looked up from his clipboard, and I watched his expression change as he took in Margaret's appearance. There was something about the way she carried herself, the quiet authority in her posture, that made people pay attention without quite knowing why. "Ma'am, I'm issuing a citation for improper flag display," he said, though his voice had lost some of its official certainty. "On what grounds?" Margaret asked, and I recognized the gentle but insistent tone she used when she wanted to understand exactly how someone had reached their conclusion. Officer Martinez consulted his clipboard again. "According to the complaint, the flag violates Municipal Code 847.3, which requires permits for exterior decorations over 12 square feet, and HOA Regulation 15B, which mandates prior approval for any changes to home exterior appearance." Margaret was quiet for a moment, and I could practically hear the gears turning in her legal mind. "Officer Martinez, may I ask who filed this complaint?" "I'm not at liberty to disclose that information, ma'am." "Of course not," Margaret said with a slight smile. "But I assume you verified that these codes actually exist and apply to flag display." Something in her tone made Officer Martinez glance down at his clipboard with less confidence than he'd shown moments before. "Well, the complaint was filed through proper channels." "I'm sure it was," Margaret agreed. "But humor me for a moment. Have you personally verified that Municipal Code 847.3 applies to flag display, or that our homeowner association has the authority to regulate the display of American flags?" Officer Martinez shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, I'm just following the complaint as it was filed." "I understand that," Margaret said gently. "But as I'm sure you know, there are federal protections for flag display that might supersede local ordinances. The Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005, for instance, prohibits homeowner associations from restricting flag display under most circumstances. I watched Officer Martinez's face as he processed this information, and I could see the exact moment when he realized he might be standing in front of someone who knew significantly more about law than he did. "Ma'am, are you an attorney?" he asked carefully. Margaret's smile was warm, but revealing nothing. "I have some familiarity with the law, yes." Officer Martinez looked from Margaret to me to the flag fluttering innocently in the morning breeze, and I could see him mentally calculating whether this was a battle worth fighting. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "I should return to the office and verify the applicable codes before proceeding with the citation." "That seems like a wise course of action," Margaret agreed. "Take all the time you need." As Officer Martinez walked back to his car, I turned to Margaret with newfound admiration. "That was impressive." "That was just getting started," she replied, and there was something in her expression that made me both excited and slightly terrified for whoever had started this whole mess. We watched Officer Martinez drive away, and then Margaret did something that surprised me. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of our flag from multiple angles. "Documentation," she explained when she caught my questioning look. "If someone wants to make this about the law, we're going to make sure we have all the facts straight." The rest of Wednesday passed quietly, but there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. Margaret went to work as usual, and I tried to focus on my client's tax problems, but I found myself glancing out the window at our flag more often than usual, as if expecting it to somehow cause more trouble just by existing. Thursday morning brought a new development. I was backing out of the driveway to head to work when I noticed a small crowd gathered around Karen Pemberton's front yard. Curiosity got the better of me, so I parked and walked over to see what was happening. Karen was holding court in front of about 6 neighbors, gesturing animatedly toward our house. As I approached, I caught fragments of her speech. "Property values, disrespectful display, taking matters into my own hands." "Good morning, everyone," I said cheerfully, and watched as the group turned toward me with varying degrees of embarrassment and defiance. Karen, however, showed no embarrassment whatsoever. "Tom," she said, her voice carrying the kind of false sweetness that usually preceded something unpleasant, "I was just explaining to everyone how your flag display is affecting our neighborhood's character." "Our flag display?" I asked, genuinely confused. "Karen, it's an American flag on our own property. It's an oversized flag that wasn't approved by the Homeowners Association," she replied, crossing her arms. "And it's hung improperly according to flag code. The whole thing is disrespectful to what the flag represents." I felt my temper starting to rise, but before I could respond, Mrs. Henderson from next door spoke up. "Karen, I think you might be overreacting. It's just a flag. Just a flag." Karen's voice rose to a pitch that made several dogs in the neighborhood start barking. "This is about rules and respect and maintaining the standards that make this neighborhood desirable." "What standards?" asked Bob Fletcher from across the street. "The standard of respecting each other's property rights?" I watched Karen's face turn red as she realized she was losing her audience. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth. "If the city won't handle this properly, I'll take it to someone who will." She turned and marched back into her house, leaving the rest of us standing there wondering what she meant by that. Mrs. Henderson patted my arm sympathetically. "Don't worry about Karen," she said. "She gets like this sometimes. It'll blow over." But as I drove to work, I had the uncomfortable feeling that this was far from over. Karen Pemberton didn't seem like the type to simply let things blow over. I was right. When I got home that evening, Margaret was waiting for me with a letter in her hand and an expression that I'd learned to recognize over the years. The look she got when someone had made a serious tactical error. "Honey," she said, holding up the letter, "we got mail." The letter was from the law firm of Pemberton, Schneider and Associates, and it was addressed to the residents of 1247 Elm Street. The letterhead was expensive looking, the kind of heavy paper that was supposed to intimidate people into compliance. "Pemberton?" I asked. "As in Karen Pemberton?" "As in Karen Pemberton's husband's law firm," Margaret confirmed. Apparently, Karen decided to escalate. I read the letter over Margaret's shoulder, and with each paragraph, my disbelief grew. The firm was demanding immediate removal of our flag, claiming it violated multiple municipal codes, homeowner association regulations, and community standards of decency. They were threatening legal action if we didn't comply within 48 hours, and they were demanding $500 in fines for each day the flag remained displayed. They're fining us $500 a day for displaying an American flag on our own property? I asked, certain I was misreading something. That's what they're claiming, Margaret said, and I could hear the barely contained amusement in her voice. Can they do that? Margaret's smile was the kind that made me remember why I'd fallen in love with her in the first place. Intelligent, confident, and just a little bit dangerous. Oh, Tom, they have no idea what they've just done. She disappeared into her home office, the converted bedroom where she sometimes worked on cases that required extra attention, and I could hear her pulling out law books and firing up her computer. When Margaret went into research mode, it was like watching a master craftsman prepare for their greatest work. I made dinner that night, something I rarely did, because I could tell Margaret was in the zone. She emerged from her office around 9 o'clock with a stack of papers and an expression that would have made defense attorneys nervous. Find anything interesting? I asked, setting a plate of reheated pasta in front of her. Oh, I found several interesting things, she said, settling into her chair with the satisfied air of a cat who'd just discovered a particularly fat mouse. Did you know that the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005 specifically prohibits homeowner associations from restricting flag display, except under very narrow circumstances? I'm learning that now, I said. And did you know that there's no municipal code 847.3 regarding flag display permits? I paused, fork halfway to my mouth. There isn't. Nope. I checked the entire municipal code. There's a section about permits for permanent structures, but nothing about flags. And our homeowner association agreement specifically states that it cannot restrict the display of American flags as long as they're displayed respectfully and don't damage property. So Karen was wrong about everything? Margaret's smile could have powered a small city. Karen was wrong about everything. But more importantly, her husband's law firm just made a serious error by threatening legal action based on non-existent laws. What does that mean? It means, Margaret said, taking a bite of pasta, that tomorrow I'm going to make some phone calls. And Karen Pemberton is going to learn that sometimes the person you're trying to intimidate has more experience with the law than you do. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that makes you feel like anything is possible. Margaret was up early, dressed in what I'd come to think of as her serious business outfit. A charcoal gray suit that somehow managed to look both professional and approachable, paired with the pearl earrings I'd given her for our 10th anniversary. Big day at the courthouse? I asked, though something in her expression told me she had plans that went beyond her usual docket. You could say that, she replied, and there was a particular glint in her eye that made me both excited and slightly nervous for whoever was about to find themselves on the receiving end of her attention. I went to work as usual, but I found it hard to concentrate on spreadsheets and tax codes when I kept thinking about Margaret's mysterious smile and the stack of legal documents she'd been preparing the night before. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang. Tom. Margaret's voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the suppressed laughter underneath. You might want to clear your schedule for lunch. We're having visitors. What kind of visitors? The kind that want to discuss flag display regulations, she said. In detail. I spent the rest of the morning wondering what Margaret had set in motion, and by the time I pulled into our driveway for lunch, I had my answer. Parked in front of our house was a sleek black sedan with official-looking plates, and standing on our front porch was a woman in a business suit who looked like she could negotiate peace treaties before breakfast. Tom, Margaret said, emerging from the house with 2 cups of coffee. I'd like you to meet Sarah Chun, the regional director of the American Civil Liberties Union. I shook hands with Sarah, who had the kind of firm grip that suggested she wasn't someone you wanted to underestimate. Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Hartwell. Your wife has been telling me about your flag situation. My wife has been busy, I said, looking at Margaret with newfound respect. Judge Hartwell is always thorough, Sarah replied, and I watched Margaret's expression carefully to see if she was bothered by having her professional identity revealed. Instead, she just smiled. I thought it was time to stop playing games, Margaret explained. Sarah specializes in First Amendment cases, and she's very interested in situations where citizens are being threatened for exercising their constitutional rights. We went inside, and Sarah spread out a folder of documents on our dining room table. Based on what Judge Hartwell has told me, and the evidence she's provided, you have a very strong case for harassment and intimidation. What kind of evidence? I asked, Margaret pulled out her phone and showed me a series of recorded calls. I spent this morning verifying everything Karen claimed in her complaint. The municipal codes she cited don't exist. The HOA regulations she referenced don't apply to flag display. And the $500 daily fine her husband's firm is demanding has no legal basis whatsoever. So what happens now? Sarah's smile was the kind that made me glad she was on our side. Now we give them a chance to make this right. I'm going to pay a visit to Pemberton, Schneider and Associates this afternoon to discuss their letter. They have until Monday to retract their demands and issue a formal apology. And if they don't, then we file a federal lawsuit for violation of civil rights, harassment, and frivolous legal threats, Sarah said matter-of-factly. Cases like this help establish precedent for protecting constitutional rights at the local level. After Sarah left, Margaret and I sat on our front porch, looking at our flag as it fluttered in the afternoon breeze. It seemed impossible that something so simple could have caused such a complex situation. You know, I said, when I married you, I knew I was getting a brilliant woman, but I had no idea how brilliant. Margaret laughed, the kind of genuine, joyful sound that had first attracted me to her all those years ago. I just don't like bullies, Tom. And I especially don't like bullies who try to use the law to intimidate people when they don't actually understand the law. Think Karen will back down? I think Karen is about to learn that actions have consequences, Margaret replied. And I think her husband is about to learn that threatening legal action without proper research is a very expensive mistake. We didn't have to wait long to find out. Around 4 o'clock, as we were both home from work and enjoying a quiet cup of coffee, we heard a commotion from the direction of Karen's house. Through our front window, we could see Karen standing in her driveway, gesticulating wildly while talking on her phone. She doesn't look happy, I observed. I imagine she's not, Margaret agreed. Sarah doesn't waste time when she's dealing with constitutional violations. About an hour later, we got our answer. Karen Pemberton came marching up our front walk with the kind of determined stride that usually preceded either an apology or a declaration of war. Given Karen's track record, I wasn't optimistic about which one we were going to get. Margaret answered the door, and I watched from the living room as Karen's expression went through several rapid changes. First confusion, then recognition, then what I could only describe as dawning horror. You, Karen said, her voice barely above a whisper. You're Judge Hartwell. I am, Margaret confirmed calmly. And you're Mrs. Pemberton. I believe we need to have a conversation. Karen's face had gone pale, and I could see her hands shaking slightly as she clutched a folded piece of paper. I didn't know. Didn't know what? Margaret asked gently. That threatening legal action based on non-existent laws is a serious matter? That harassing your neighbors for exercising their constitutional rights might have consequences. I was just trying to maintain neighborhood standards, Karen said, her voice small and uncertain, a far cry from the confident woman who'd been holding court in her front yard just days before. By filing false complaints and demanding illegal fines? Margaret's voice remained gentle, but there was steel underneath. Mrs. Pemberton, you and your husband's firm threatened to take legal action against us for displaying an American flag on our own property. You cited laws that don't exist and demanded fines you have no authority to impose. Karen held out the paper she'd been clutching. The ACLU sent this to Richard's firm. They're threatening to sue us for civil rights violations. They're not threatening, Margaret corrected. They're giving you an opportunity to make this right before they take action. What do you want? Karen asked, and for the first time since we'd known her, she sounded genuinely afraid. Margaret considered this for a moment. I want you to understand that your neighbors have rights, Mrs. Pemberton. The same rights you have. The right to display a flag on their own property, the right to live peacefully without harassment, and the right to not be intimidated by false legal threats. I understand, Karen said quickly. I do. This whole thing got out of hand. Yes, it did, Margaret agreed. And now we need to discuss how to prevent it from happening again. They talked for about 20 minutes, and I watched Karen's posture change from defensive to apologetic to something approaching respectful. When Margaret explained the legal principles behind flag display rights, Karen actually took notes. When she outlined the potential consequences of filing false complaints, Karen nodded earnestly. By the time Karen left, she looked like a different person, chastened certainly, but also somehow more thoughtful than I'd ever seen her. As she walked back toward her house, she stopped and turned back. Judge Hartwell, she called out, your flag looks very nice. Margaret smiled. Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton. I think so too. That evening, we got a call from Sarah Chin. You'll be pleased to know that Pemberton, Schneider and Associates has agreed to retract their letter and issue a formal apology. They're also making a donation to the ACLU to support First Amendment education programs. That's wonderful, Margaret said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. There's one more thing, Sarah added. Mrs. Pemberton called this afternoon to ask if she could volunteer with our community education program. She wants to help teach people about constitutional rights and the proper way to address neighborhood disputes. After Margaret hung up, we sat together on our front porch, watching the sun set behind our flag. The fabric caught the golden light, and for a moment, it seemed to glow with its own inner fire. You know, I said, I think this might be the best thing that's ever happened to this neighborhood. How so? Well, Karen learned about constitutional rights. Our neighbors learned that they don't have to put up with harassment. And everyone learned that sometimes the quiet woman next door might be more than she appears. Margaret laughed. And you learned that your wife doesn't back down from a fight. I already knew that, I said, taking her hand. That's one of the reasons I married you. What are the other reasons? I looked at her, this brilliant, compassionate woman who'd spent her day fighting for our rights and educating our neighbor, and I felt that familiar flutter of love and admiration that had been growing stronger for 22 years. Your sense of justice, I said. Your kindness. The way you can be gentle and fierce at the same time. The way you make me want to be a better person. Anything else? The way you make the best lasagna in 3 counties, I added, and she laughed. That's a good reason, she agreed. As the stars came out that night, our flag continued to flutter in the gentle breeze, a symbol of everything we'd fought for and everything we'd protected. It was more than just fabric and thread. It was a reminder that ordinary people can stand up for their rights, that communities can grow and change, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not in courtrooms or legislatures, but in the quiet suburbs where neighbors learn to respect each other. Karen Pemberton never filed another complaint about anyone's property. In fact, she became something of a neighborhood advocate, helping resolve disputes and educating residents about their rights and responsibilities. She and Margaret never became close friends, but they developed a mutual respect that made the whole neighborhood a more pleasant place to live. The flag still hangs outside our house, and every time I see it, I'm reminded of the day my wife showed me what it really means to defend freedom. Not with grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but with quiet dignity, careful research, and the unshakable belief that everyone deserves to live peacefully in their own home. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light is just right, I swear I can see Margaret's smile reflected in those red, white, and blue stripes. The smile of a woman who knows that justice isn't just something you read about in law books, but something you live every single day. That's the story of how Karen found my wife for hanging a flag, and how she found out that my wife was a federal judge. But more than that, it's the story of how a simple piece of fabric became a symbol of everything that's right about America. The belief that ordinary people can stand up for their rights, that communities can grow and change, and that sometimes the most important victories are won not in courtrooms, but in the quiet moments when neighbors learn to respect each other. Because at the end of the day, that's what the flag really represents, not just the idea of freedom, but the daily choice to protect and defend it, one conversation, one neighbor, one small act of courage at a time.